You're listening to Adapt and Thrive, the podcast that explores the breathtaking pace of change and the technologies enterprises are relying on to make smarter, faster, and more intentional business decisions. My name is Matt Gunn, and on this episode, we're going to take a look at sustainability in the supply chain. For many multinational enterprises, the supply chain comprises a massive portion of the overall carbon footprint. And many businesses have made specific initiatives to lower their emissions over the next 10 to 20 years. But what does that actually mean when it comes to the supply chain? And how do you actually measure results? Joining me for the conversation is Nate Rosier, Vice President of Strategy at Invista. Welcome, Nate. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your company.
Great. I've worked for Invista for 8 years now, and I run the supply chain strategy practice. And in the supply chain strategy practice at Invista, we help companies design supply chains. We also help them with their planning and forecasting strategies, as well as their operational strategies. Invista as a whole has 750 associates globally, and we're the only mid-sized supply chain focused consulting firm. We do have services that cover everything from transportation, inventory, facility design, systems implementation, and we also have some specific software that helps companies with order management and transportation management.
Excellent. So you're hitting a pretty wide range across the supply chain, and I think that's going to play well in today's conversation about sustainability. You know, as I alluded to, it's a very here and now subject. In fact, it's also part of the mission statement and culture at LlamaSoft to elevate lives and organizations through the science of smart decision making. Now, there's no greater complex business problem that needs an answer today than the balance between commerce and the environment. Invista is also dedicated to this same practice of sustainability. In fact, they're a 7-time recipient of the Supply and Demand Chain Executive Green Supply Chain Award. Nate, sustainability must be important to your organization, as well as all of those functional areas of the supply chain that you had mentioned.
Yeah, Invista actually is a leader in building a more sustainable world by helping global supply chains reduce waste and overall emissions. If you think about our goal in Invista is to help companies reduce their total footprint, and obviously that affects pollution, while at the same time improving service and profitability. And one of the reasons why we have so many services is that we find that the right combination of service and software and implementation, companies can achieve all of those.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, I think there is a popular definition of sustainability that's shared by the EPA. Basically, kind of the idea being that sustainability is about balancing economic, social, and environmental concerns.
Well, to us, we're very supply chain focused, and that goes all the way back to the factory. And I think from a supply chain, you're always trying to find the right balance of emissions, pollution, cost, inventory, and good service, right? So from our standpoint, we want to make sure that we're manufacturing or sourcing with short lead times close to the points of demand. We will always want to minimize transportation miles, on optimizing and reducing packaging, which is typically a lot of waste, and also inventory waste. There's tremendous amounts of inventory waste and returns by inefficient and ineffective forecasting and planning. And you put all those things together, it creates a sustainable supply chain.
So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to slice this up, as you mentioned. I'm curious, you know, it goes to kind of the chicken and egg question, but what is driving the push for an enterprise to think about sustainability? Is there a specific area that they're trying to enhance or look for savings? What do you typically see when you're working with customers?
So one of the interesting things about sustainability is it ties directly to costs. If you're able to reduce costs in specific areas of supply chain, it translates directly into more sustainable. So every mile you take out of transportation, that direct percentage of emissions is reduced. So it's one of the best ways that a company can reduce their overall costs as well as become more sustainable. But also, if you think about it, there's a lot more waste inside of a supply chain that is directly related to sustainability. So, you know, if you chase costs and you source product on the other side of the world, it's fantastic. But there are other hidden costs associated with that. it's not just transportation. It's also cycle times, lead time, inventory waste, and other factors. And one of the things we do is try to highlight what those costs are. And once we do, it's easy to focus on the areas that help you reduce those costs, reduce those cycle times, create more efficiency in your supply chain. And that translates directly into sustainability.
Excellent. And I think all of those points that you covered have to translate well to someone who's working in the supply chain, someone who analyzes these challenges and is trying to improve efficiency in one way or another as part of their day job. Is the supply chain the space to drive sustainability, or are there other parts of the organization that have to be moving in lockstep with those initiatives?
So the two really biggest areas that we find for opportunities are obviously manufacturing and supply chain. And they're obviously, they're inextricably linked. So, there could be quite a bit of manufacturing waste. Most factories are optimized in some way to reduce their waste and be efficient. But are they manufacturing in the right places? Are they sourcing from the right locations? And that supply chain that supports a factory is very important. And then from the factory forward to the consumer, creating an efficient supply chain from that area is another big source of opportunity. And those two together really are some of the biggest drivers of emissions in the commercial world.
That's a great point. So there's different sub areas even within the supply chain that you can focus on. And there's a lot of different initiatives that you can take to start making a difference. I'm really curious also, how do you build the right level of information to make all of those decisions, to answer those types of questions? Is there a means that you work with customers on to help ease that side of it, to understand where their best bets are as they want to embark on something as big and potentially as broad as sustainability, and distill it down into terms that they can truly own and feel that they can measure and make a difference against?
So it's an interesting challenge, which is to quantify some of the opportunities that exist. So the easiest one are transportation miles. Usually a transportation mile and mode can be translated directly to a carbon impact. Harder ones are lead times and inventory levels and missed sales and other things that are difficult. So what we focus on is when we take a look at a supply chain strategy is to quantify those pieces. So we'll say, we can analyze and to tell you specifically, if I squeeze one day out of my forecast planning cycle, this is how much reduced square footage of warehouse I need. Here's how much less cost I have. Here's how much less utilities I have to pay. We quantify to that level of detail. And so they can see what the impact of some of the changes you would make. If you think about a supply chain, you have a sliding scale. It's like a big equalizer. You have a lot of, actually, nobody uses equalizers anymore, do they? All right, just scratch that. It's like a big sliding scale of all these factors between my planning cycles and my manufacturing costs, my sourcing, and all these pieces. And what we do is we show you what the trade-off is of sliding these back and forth, manufacturing closer, repositioning your distribution centers. And so once they're quantified, the decisions aren't that hard to make because you know what the trade-off is. You know what your cost trade-off, you know what your carbon footprint trade-off is. But that is one of the challenges that, outside of transportation miles, it becomes complicated. It's a complicated calculation.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems like data is the only way to generate that certainty, that truth around what it is that you're trying to do, and then measure it.
Well, so there are two ways to look at it. We need accurate data, but when we do supply chain design or strategies with LlamaSoft specifically, all of that content is required anyway for a project. And then what we're able to do in a LlamaSoft software is optimize those trade-offs, right? So it'll tell you the different ways you can optimize those trade-offs and to make good decisions. And so it is data-driven, but again, when we do our projects, when we do our analysis, all that data, it's the same data we use. It's nothing new.
Excellent. Can you get into some examples of those types of initiatives? I mean, certainly, you don't have to name customers, but for those that are listening, what are some types of stories or anecdotes that you might be able to draw from where bringing all of that together for someone really helped them make a difference on their initiatives?
Yeah, one customer that's fun to discuss is a grocery client in Canada, and they have over 1,000 locations all the way up to the Arctic Circle, all across Canada, and they source predominant amount of their product, right, grocery food, in the United States. So you have very long supply chains. Transportation miles are at a premium, and it's difficult because, shipping things to the Arctic Circle is very different in June than it is in January. So what we're able to do is help them understand what is the best way to bring product from the US or other places into their supply chain, where I position it, right, inside of in Canada, because there's a lot of miles between the distribution centers. And then what is the frequency of replenishment and bringing product up? Because we don't want to, a lot of these products are perishable or have expiration dates. We want to make sure that we are efficient and get it there fast. And then also what's important is how much should I order, right? You don't want to throw away product or have product expired. So another critical thing is to tell them, how much should we order, how frequently we should order these products, at what level. And we did a total cost model, and that helped them actually reduce their carbon footprint by over about 10 to 12% across their entire supply chain, which was fairly significant, I think.
And that's a great point that often seems to go undersung in a lot of sustainability discussions is product spoilage, the amount of food or products that are perishable that are wasted. I mean, that's a tremendous cost when you look at it in the aggregate, but I would imagine for a business, that can be a pretty big chunk too, especially with long supply chains like you were just discussing.
Yeah, and groceries are a great example because they have a tremendous impact on the environment, both with organic growers as well as their impact through manufacturing, fishing, right? I mean, there's a lot of pieces to it. So one of the things that we do when we work in the grocery industry is try to help, create the most efficient possible way to get product where it needs to go, and also help them create a simple way of managing the complexity of local sourcing and other things. So it's it all kind of works together, but grocery is a complicated business. Yeah,
absolutely. You've talked on that theme a little bit about sourcing nearer to the points of demand. Is that always possible? In certain examples? I mean, I would imagine there are pieces in grocery that you can do, just taking from the area we're just discussing. But is the world getting back to a place where there's enough production or capacity locally that you're able to source closer? Or is that not always the reality?
So it's, I wouldn't say that it's shifting back. I would say that we're finding a different balance. And grocery is an example of, localized products are things that consumers want. And, I ran a grocery chain a few years back, and, I would say, 40% of my products were locally sourced, and those are unsophisticated sources, right? It's not Procter & Gamble. So you have to have a supply chain that can handle very unsophisticated inbound, and you also have to have an efficient, sophisticated, source. And trying to manage all those vendors in the same supply chain is what creates the challenge. Oh, and it's also a cold chain, right? You have to maintain the perishability. Oh, and organic also cuts that perishability down dramatically. You don't have much of a window to sell it. So those are the kind of pressures that they see in grocery, which is fun for us, right? Because we like solving those kinds of problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of areas that you can dive into. And I guess part of the reason I ask about the sourcing aspect of it is the whole consumer side of it too. In fact, I mean, I've even seen research that indicates up to 30% of shoppers are going to buy or boycott based on values that they agree with. And especially in the sustainability efforts. Are you seeing a push in the supply chain that's coming from that outside world as well, not only to reduce carbon footprints and become more sustainable, but also to show your work and show the customers or end consumers maybe, that you are working toward achieving these goals?
It's industry specific. So I would say in grocery, absolutely. In apparel, you'll see some, but not as much. And then you get into other consumer products, you don't see much of it at all. However, the flip side of that is it's conscious. It's something that supply chain leaders look at. What are ways I can create more efficiency? It's just inherent, right? If I create better installation of my distribution center, it saves me money. right? If I minimize my truck turn or if I minimize my empty miles on my trucks, it saves you money. And so every industry is really chasing that, but only a few of them are really trying to, I think, market that. And from a consumer standpoint, my experience has been that the companies that focus on these are some of the best companies in the world that make the best products anyway, right? So it's kind of just a piece of being a great company is that they're great stewards to the environment.
Yeah, no, I mean, it does seem to be a trend that some of the areas that even from an outside point looking in that are making progress are leaders, are the ones that not only work to make a difference, but are very proud about the impact that they make. And that it can be a huge effect, from a buyer perspective, at least speaking personally. To get to that culture, I mean, it does seem like there is a cultural aspect here. And certainly, how do you motivate an organization to just buy into sustainability is the question that kind of pops up in my mind quite often. I asked maybe if it's the supply chain driving this earlier, but I guess, from your experience, what does it take to get all parts of the organization moving in the same direction?
I often feel that one of the biggest gaps is measuring, right? So we manage what we measure, and most of my clients don't really measure until we bring it up to them, and they don't. It's not visible to them, right? Dollars are visible, so they manage the dollars, or they manage transportation costs, or they manage, labor costs, but they don't see the environmental impact or carbon footprint impacts. So that's really step one, is measuring it and providing it as a visibility. I think the other piece is we think about how do you move forward? There's a significant trend in the industry for what's called supply chain transformation or transformation type of initiatives. And a transformation initiative is not continuous improvement. It's much more significant, right? It's a stepwise change in performance that leads to a different direction. And those are the opportunities, right? If I measure and say, hey, I have an opportunity here in carbon footprint, if I do my transformation, could it be supported by transformation? Well, I could tell you every transformation initiative I've been involved with in supply chain, and that's about 50 a year, will reduce carbon footprint by the design of it, right? It's just not measured. So if you tie that measurement to it, it's an easy win. You can say, hey, look, here's an opportunity for me to reduce environmental impact as well as cost, improve service and profitability. And so I think that's really kind of the key piece to driving the culture, is make sure it's visible and that they see it, and that folks can easily take steps to improve it, because it's a step that you would take to improve the business in general, right? It's just part of business.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I mean, and it does seem to me that transformation is a massive leap forward for a lot of organizations. So, in that sense, it's logical that as you're getting more digital technologies, as you're measuring, as you're really diving into the data, that you can bring sustainability and very naturally to that discussion. Now, I asked about a couple techniques among colleagues as well, and on driving that buy-in, and they kind of had a few areas that they describe as like hot or warm. So like hot, an example of that, go talk to your colleagues in that other department, right? So just having the conversation is also a big step in this. The idea that sustainability and supply chain teams aren't always linked together, or maybe even measuring things at the same level, but ultimately those goals have to have synchronicity between those areas if you're really going to drive big changes. More on the warm spectrum, less likely to drive buy-in is starting with something like emissions or waste factors in your analysis. Certainly it's a means of measuring or reporting, but realistically, it doesn't seem that people do make decisions based on those types of metrics. Ultimately, as the organization realizes that they have a team and tool set that allows them to analyze and understand trade-offs, maybe those are areas that you can measure, but certainly it's not that really great conversation starter, that thing that you would lead with. So, I mean, it really does seem to drive toward that conversation around transformation. Is that kind of what you would consider to be realistic? Those types of areas?
Yeah, I think they help. When I think about what a company is going to invest resources in. It's going to be to improve competitive advantage, cost, or to drive sales, right? To drive growth. And that's it, right? That's what companies are designed to do. And so the factors and analysis have to tie to one of those three or all three. And in many cases, it can be all three. When we design supply chains or strategies, we basically try to look at the trade-offs between those and determine the impact to carbon and overall pollution to see what that sliding scale looks like and the trade-off is. And so if you can tie to one of those three things and make sure that it's part of the conversation and the metric, then you will see a benefit to it. You'll see companies put some focus against it, but it's got to be tied to one of those three, right? No, there's no company that's going to say, "Hey, look, let's forget about cost and growth and right. profit and focus on sustainability." Yeah, it's not going to work, right? So as long as they can tie it to those three. But the good news is it is. I mean, there's a direct correlation to them. So,
right, and that's very important. It seems in this massive topic. Is having those measurements and having those areas where it truly benefits all parties. Certainly as we close out, any other kind of areas that you think are interesting on this topic or that you see future developments really starting to make a difference?
Yeah, so there are two things. The first one is the impact of e-commerce. So one of the things that we see with the impact of e-commerce is it increases the volatility of consumer demand. People buy much less consistently than they would if things were in the store. It's obvious, right? It's 100% available all the time, so you buy when you want to buy it, not when it's in the store. That volatility has a ripple effect up the supply chain where it's difficult to forecast it and manufacture it. Also, e-commerce has a much higher returns rate than store purchases. So one of the big issues is this returns is 100% waste, right? The reverse logistics process is 100% waste. So what we've done with e-commerce, we made it harder to get the right product in the right place at the right time. And we've induced this tremendous amount of waste on product coming back that consumers weren't able to tried it, didn't like it, and sent it back. So those are two negative impacts to the environment driven by the e-commerce growth. And those are things that we help companies look at and quantify because at the moment it's difficult, other than pure dollars, it's difficult for them to see what's happening to them. And the other thing is, this is something that I tell folks that work with me in Invista in a completely different area. There's no place that you can get a job coming out of college that'll make a bigger impact on the environment than this one. Because we go to a big company, we knock out 10% of their costs in their supply chain. That is a tremendous amount of carbon that's taken out. There's no activism you can do that's more effective. There's no type of visibility improvement. There is no type, you can't plant enough trees. Okay. The best way to create immediate impact, right? Even if you shift manufacturing, that takes years, right? The most immediate impact you can make in the environment for the young folks that work on my team is designing a more efficient supply chain. So I think we're very excited about that. We're part of the global efficiency movement and making a more sustainable world.
Excellent. Yeah. Both credible points. One, e-commerce and trying to get your hand around all of the challenges there, whether it's reverse logistics, returns, and even just, to me, it seems like the higher order volume of fewer things that seems to come naturally with like the quick ability to get a specific thing when you want it, right now from a consumer. But yes, fully agree that there's a tremendous opportunity there to change the way that sustainability is measured and viewed and also enacted by working with these massive supply chains. So very strong points there. Thank you very much, Nate, for joining the conversation today. For those of you in the audience, you can learn more about Invista online at envistacorp.com. And certainly for the podcast, find us at lamasoft.com/podcast, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite downloadable media. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, or email me at matt.gunn@lamasoft.com. Thanks for listening to Adapt and Thrive.